We came, we saw, he died.
Have you heard about the deadliest day on the Clinton body count list? The story begins on April 3rd, 1996. President Clinton's Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown, was flying from Bosnia to war-torn Croatia. He was heading a delegation of business executives and government officials. The goal was to explore investment opportunities in what was the former Yugoslavia. This never happened as the plane tragically crashed into a mountainside near Dubrovnik, Croatia. All 35 people on board died. All but 2 were Americans. According to an Air Force inquiry, the official reason for the crash was pilot error and a poorly designed landing approach.
There are no known survivors at this time. Croatian Air Control says the plane was cleared to land at Dubrovnik's airport, but instead it apparently went off course and slammed into a cloud-shrouded mountain. Brown's party was arriving from Tuzla, where U.S. peacekeeping troops are based.
Secretary Brown and a delegation of high-level U.S. executives first traveled to Tuzla on board the very same plane that U.S. Defense Secretary William Perry flew in just last week. The plane is the Air Force equivalent of a Boeing 737. U.S. Ambassador Peter Galbraith awaited the Commerce Secretary's arrival in Dubrovnik. But 5 minutes short of the anticipated landing, Croatian authorities report losing radar contact with Brown's plane. Weather was poor.
The Air Force went on a rampage, punishing 16 officers for the crash. 4 received a reprimand, including 1 3-star general. The remaining dozen either received letters of admonishment, counseling, or verbal counseling. But this is a series on the Clinton body count, so there's got to be more to the story. An organization called Judicial Watch was knee-deep in a lawsuit against Secretary Brown. After his death, they indicated there might have been foul play. This statement comes from a 1998 press release from the organization. Quote, "The Armed Forces Institute of Pathology was asked to examine the body. What the pathologists and photographers found was a hole in Secretary Brown's head, the size and shape of a .45 caliber bullet. Interviews on BET television with the chief military pathologist suggest that he wanted to conduct an autopsy to see if the hole was the result of a gunshot wound, but he was called off by the White House Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Clinton-Gore Commerce and Transportation Departments. However, a military photographer, sensing that something was not right, photographed X-rays of Ron Brown's skull, which hung on light boxes. These photographs show what may be metal fragments in his brain, consistent with a gunshot wound. Except for these photographs, other X-rays taken in the lab are now mysteriously missing. Pathologists in the lab wanted to conduct an autopsy. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a renowned physician and pathologist and a Democrat, has said that the failure to conduct an autopsy was a gross deviation from accepted medical practice. It is also violative of the policy of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Okay, so what if that was a bullet hole? Why would Clinton benefit from Secretary Ron Brown dying? Well, when Ron Brown died in that plane crash, he was already a material witness in a lawsuit by Judicial Watch against the Commerce Department. Brown was expected to testify. It was suspected that Brown was selling seats on trade missions, using this exclusive opportunity as a way to reward donors, much like that trade mission that Ron Brown led of 35 people that would then crash and die on their way to Croatia. Ron Brown was also under investigation by an independent counsel for corruption and was likely to be indicted. According to his business partner and confidant, Nolanda Hill, Brown told President Clinton that he would negotiate a plea deal with the independent counsel. He was planning to tell them what he knew about the alleged illegalities in the Clinton-Gore administration. Clinton, allegedly, did not receive that news very well. Days later, Brown was asked to unexpectedly travel to Croatia, where he died in a plane crash. When Brown died, so did the independent investigation into him, and the counsel reached no conclusions on whether Brown violated any laws. However, during Judicial Watch's lawsuit, a man named John Wong also emerged. He was suspected of soliciting illegal campaign contributions from China, as well as helping sell seats on taxpayer-funded trade missions in exchange for campaign contributions. Thousands of papers were turned over to Judicial Watch for their lawsuit, and correspondence appeared to indicate that the donors did expect a seat on these trips. This whole debacle would go on to be called Chinagate. The Clinton administration denied any quid pro quo. They also denied allegations that seats on these trips went for as much as $100,000. However, unnamed sources said at the time donating did help one's chances of getting a seat. So, Ron Brown's death was convenient, but it doesn't mean anything nefarious happened, right? It was a plane crash after all and ruled an accident. Well, let me introduce you to the expert on this conspiracy, Jack Cassill. He is an investigative journalist, and he literally wrote the book on this topic. It's called Ron Brown's Body. While Cassill originally thought the official story might be a cover-up for a terrorist attack, he discovered there was much more to what happened on that plane that crashed into a mountainside. He summarized his findings in an article more than 20 years ago. According to Jack Cassill, in addition to possibly selling seats on trade missions, Ron Brown was also on his way to, quote, broker a sweetheart deal between the neo-fascist strongman who ran Croatia, Franjo Tuđman, and Enron Corporation. Yes, that Enron, the one that epically collapsed in the early 2000s. Cassill claims this was, quote, part of the Clintons' desperate drive to raise money for their 1996 re-election campaign. Cassill lays out a lengthy list of suspicious facts about Ron Brown's last days and the circumstances regarding the trip. Let's take a look. Just weeks before his death, Brown started going to church for the first time in his life. He was apparently scared for his life. Just weeks before his death, Brown started going to church for the very first time. He was also apparently scared for his life and that of his confidant, Nolanda Hill. The Croatian government insisted on a Dubrovnik stop. They did this unprecedentedly in a mere 36 hours before Brown's scheduled landing. Those Enron executives that were trying to get a deal, they didn't ride with Ron Brown. Instead, they took their own plane. The Air Force called the pilot's nearly 2-mile deviation into a Croatian hillside inexplicable. No aircraft has ever drifted inland before at that airport. The AWACS data suggests sabotage of the ground-based navigation system, a line of inquiry that the Air Force is not allowed to pursue. For the first time ever on friendly soil, the White House orders the Air Force to skip the safety phase of the investigation and move directly to the accident phase. There is to be no consideration other than accident, even though this airport is near the Bosnian border and in a potential hot fire zone. 3 days after the crash and 2 days before his scheduled interview by the Air Force, the Croatian responsible for the airport's navigation system is found dead with a bullet hole in his chest. As previously mentioned, every pathologist who views Brown's body concludes his head wound, at the very least, looks like a bullet hole. In a decision that reached the White House, there is no autopsy to be conducted. The Brown family is not informed, nor is there any forensic testing or a search for an exit wound. And as also mentioned before, the head x-rays that show a possible lead snowstorm are lost. The 3 armed forces pathologists and the forensic photographer who blew the whistle on this case all had their careers destroyed. The top brass of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology told the public that Brown died of, quote, multiple blunt force injuries, just like everybody else on the plane. However, the death certificate says otherwise. It notes that Brown died of, quote, blunt force injuries to the head. He was the only one of the 35 victims to have a reported head wound. And finally, the son of the man trying to broker a deal with Enron is the one who ends up investigating the death of that navigation chief and rules that to be a suicide. Cassill concludes that, quote, Croatian intelligence agents coerced the navigation chief into sabotaging the airport's non-directional radio beacon. After the plane crashes, they divert the rescue efforts, go to the crash site, and administer a coup de grace to Brown, who may already be dead. 3 days later, they murder the airport's navigation chief, lest the Air Force investigators persuade him to talk. Who commissioned the Croatians is not known, although the list of suspects is small. If the commission came from Washington, it likely did not include the destruction of the aircraft. Cassill goes on to say that, quote, the Clintons use a reluctant Air Force and a nearly mutinous Armed Forces Institute of Pathology to bury Ron Brown as quickly as possible, literally and figuratively. They exploit Brown's death for political advantage and leave the truth buried with him. Without an autopsy or a serious investigation, this is where it remains to this day. Cassill goes on to say that, quote, the Clintons use a reluctant Air Force and a nearly mutinous Armed Forces Institute of Pathology to bury Ron Brown as quickly as possible, literally and figuratively. They exploit Brown's death for political advantage and leave the truth buried with him. Without an autopsy or a serious investigation, that is where it remains to this day. So what do you think? Was Ron Brown shot in the head and the plane crash used as a cover-up? Or is it merely just an accident? Or is this another mysterious death linked to the Clintons? I wear my tinfoil hat every day, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Now that you know where we've been, find out where we're going. Tune in to Ladies Love Politics, where you can stay informed without going insane.